Genesis is a pretty amazing book. In the first 11 chapters, we saw the beginning of peoples and the world itself. But in this part, we will see the origin of the Hebrew people and where they came from. The father of faith is about to be introduced, and he will show us what it takes to please God. From the very beginning, God gives us the blueprint for how we ought to relate to him and be his friend. Now, as I said in part 1, I could easily teach for hundreds of hours on the book of Genesis alone, so I will inevitably have to leave certain things out. If you have any specific questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer them all. I also highly recommend reading the book of Genesis on your own in conjunction with this video, because I will be skipping over some details. Contained in the life of Abraham is easily one of my favorite stories in the whole Bible. If you at any point get bored while watching this video, please at least skip to this timestamp where we would be going over my favorite story, the binding of Isaac. It's truly an amazing story with insane depth that you just can't miss. So with that said, let's begin. Everyone say hello to Abram. He's not Abraham yet. He's a pagan, probably a polytheist, who just got a little visit from God. God calls him out of his home country and to a land far away. God also gives him this promise. Abram believes God's promise and goes to the land of Canaan along with his wife Sarai, who has a barren womb, and his nephew Lot. If you remember the Canaanites, they're the cursed descendants of Ham, and generally speaking, they're pretty wicked people who follow in the sins of their father. While in Canaan, God tells Abram, "I'll give this land to your descendants." There's only one issue with that promise, however. Abram has no kids. Soon after arriving in Canaan, a famine breaks out, and Abram heads to Egypt. He's quite afraid of going there because his wife Sarai is very beautiful, despite being 65 at the time. He's afraid Pharaoh will kill him and take his wife as his own. So Abraham does something that will happen a few times in the book of Genesis. He has a lapse of faith and he lies and tells Pharaoh Sarai is his sister, which is half true. Pharaoh treats him very well for this and gives him lots of stuff. God, however, inflicts Pharaoh with diseases, and Pharaoh returns Abram's wife to him and is like, "Hey man, what the heck? Why'd you lie to me?" So Abram leaves with all of his new stuff. This story is a parallel to what will happen later in the book of Genesis and in Exodus. Jacob's family will go to Egypt because of a famine in the land. They stay for a while, God inflicts Egypt with plagues because they're oppressing the people, and the Israelites will leave with lots of wealth. One thing I want you to notice about the life of Abraham is how his faith seems to fluctuate. When most people think about having faith, they see it almost as something that never wanes or fluctuates. It always remains the same. You either have it or you don't, but that's not quite how it works. Faith can grow stronger or it can weaken. Rather than looking like this, it looks more like this. I want you to think of faith like a seed that grows into a tree. Does a tree just continually grow at the same rate? No, that's why trees have rings. Some seasons will lack rain, and that will slow the growth. Other times, it will be winter, and that will slow the growth as well. And then others, the conditions will be better and the tree will grow rapidly. What I'm trying to say here is that faith works a lot like this tree. Some seasons will have more growth than others. The important part is that we keep growing. When a tree stops growing, it means it will start dying. Keep this tree analogy in mind because it will be coming back later in this video. After leaving Egypt, Abram and Lot decide that they have too much stuff and it's time to part ways. Lot goes into the valley of the Jordan where Sodom and Gomorrah are, while Abram goes back to Canaan. Sodom is an exceedingly wicked place, and Lot sets up camp right next door. Keep this in mind for later because it's going to be very important. Lot is flirting with sin, not quite living in it yet, but he's close. Now, a few kings go to war, including the king of Sodom, and since Lot is right next to the city, he gets captured along with all of his possessions. Abram hears about it and riles 318 of his own men to counterattack and save his nephew. He succeeds in rescuing him along with all of his possessions, and after the battle, we meet a very interesting guy. His name is Melchizedek, king of Salem, and he is priest of God Most High. His name means King of Righteousness, and he's King of Salem, which means he's the King of Peace, and he's a priest of God Most High, and he's going to offer Abraham and his men a meal of bread and wine, and he's greater than Abram because he blesses him. Now, if you aren't seeing any parallels, then let me make this easy for you. Some go so far as to say that Melchizedek is a pre-incarnate Jesus Christ. I personally don't go that far, but he certainly is a very obvious picture of Christ. In fact, the writer of Hebrews says as much. Jesus is a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek, because there was no beginning or no end to his priesthood, and he's both king and the priest. Levitical priests live and they die, but Jesus is the superior priest because he has no beginning or end. He will always be there to intercede for us. Jesus is the King of righteousness and peace. He is greater than Abram. He instituted his covenant with bread and wine. He is a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. The picture couldn't be any clearer. It makes sense that people think this could be Christ because he is so similar in every possible way. There's certainly more to be said about this guy, but we don't have time. Maybe I'll go into that more when I do Hebrews. So after this, God appears to Abram again to reiterate some promises. A quick point I want to make here is that we need to be reminding ourselves of God's promises too. God has placed his promises for us in his word, and we need to read them often as a reminder. It can be easy to forget them in the monotony of life or in difficult times. Abram will sometimes go many years without hearing from God, but he can always remember what God has promised him in the past and use that as fuel for his faith for what God will do for him in the future. So back to the story. Abram says, "What can you give me? I have no son to come after me." And God says to Abram, "Look at the stars in the sky. Count them if you can. Your descendants will be like them." Every time I read this, I remember a time when I was living in an underdeveloped country where there would be blackouts just about every night. I'd be brushing my teeth outside and the power would go out, and I'd look up at the stars and just be blown away by just how many there were. Uncountable numbers of them. Light pollution steals that beauty from us every night. You're lucky to see a few hundred these days. So Abram hears this promise and he believes it. And here is our key verse. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. Believing God and his promises is what makes us righteous. This goes against what everyone tells you. Most people and religions would say, doing good things is what makes you righteous. But here we see that Abram hasn't really done anything yet except believe in God, and yet God credits it to him as righteousness. It isn't until later that we see that his faith turns into action. So let's talk about this for a minute because it's very important. We have to ask, what pleases God? Faith or works? The simple answer to this question is kind of both. But you can't have one without the other. Let me explain. Faith is required for a work to be considered good in the eyes of God. Without faith, there are no works that could be considered pleasing to God. Hebrews 11:6 says, without faith, it's impossible to please God. But we also know from James that if someone claims to have faith but has no good deeds, then how can that faith save him? So faith and works work together, and if someone claims to have good works and thinks that that's enough to please God, well, that's obviously not going to be possible. And if someone claims that, hey, I just have faith, I don't need any good works, well, that's not going to work either. You need both. But the real question is, what comes first, the faith or the works? Let's go back to our tree analogy from earlier. Faith is represented by the tree. A good tree that is strong in faith will produce good fruits, or good works, just as Jesus says. The tree must come first. We need faith first in order to please God with our good works, that again flow out of our faith. Faith is ultimately what pleases God and saves us. Our good works flow out of it and are proof that our faith is real, or that our tree is good. That's why we have examples of guys like the thief on the cross, who simply believe in Christ and is saved even though he didn't have time to do any good works. The only good work he did was believe in the Son, as Jesus would say. When Jesus is asked, what works must be done to please God, he says, the work of God is this, to believe in the one whom he has sent. Let's look at a verse that sums this up pretty well. Most know Ephesians 2:8 and 9. It says, for it is by grace that you have been saved through faith, and this is not from yourself, it is a gift from God, not by works, so that no one can boast. A clear teaching that faith is what saves, not works. But most stop here and don't read the next verse. For we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. You see that? Our works don't save us because our works aren't our own. They are really God's works that are done through us. God gets credit for our works, and God gets glory for them because of it. You will hear a lot of debates in Christian circles on this topic. Are we saved by faith alone or faith plus works? The answer is ultimately that we are saved by faith, but faith that saves will inevitably have works that follow. Otherwise, it isn't faith that saves. So let's go back to Abram now to show you what I mean. God is going to call Abraham to do something crazy. Abraham can say all day that he has faith, but it isn't until that faith turns into action that we learn that his faith is real. You'll see what I mean soon. Sorry for this long aside, but it's extremely important. Don't try to please God by works alone. It won't work. Pray that God gives you faith and let God do the good works through you. I will go into much more detail in later videos on Romans and James. So, back to Genesis 15. We are about to see a covenant that's very important. The covenant is about Abraham obtaining the promised land. God tells Abraham to cut some animals in half and prepare a covenant. The way this would work is if two people wanted to make an oath, they'd cut an animal in half, lay it on the ground, state their side of the deal, and walk between the two pieces, therefore confirming the oath. If one person broke their side of the oath, then the other person is free from their end as well. A weird way of doing it, I know, but that's just how it was. But here we are going to see that after Abram cuts the animals in half, God is going to put him into a deep sleep, and God alone is going to walk through the pieces. This is because this covenant is not based on Abram at all. It's an unconditional covenant that God is making with Abram. There are different kinds of covenants in the Bible. Some are conditional, while others aren't. God is going to give Abram children, and they will possess the land. That's the promise. If Abram messes up, it doesn't matter. God is going to keep his side of the bargain. So Sarai, after hearing this news, who is past the age of bearing children, decides that she is going to come up with a plan to help God fulfill his promise. She knows she's too old to bear children, so she needs another plan. How about you sleep with my slave Hagar and have a child through her, and it will be as if it's my own because it was done through my slave. This is apparently a common practice because it happens again later in Genesis. Abram agrees to this and it works. She bears a son named Ishmael. Hagar is feeling like some tough stuff now and she starts mocking Sarai. So Sarai gets mad at Abram for doing what she told him to do, and Sarah treats Hagar badly, so she runs away. Hagar is now in the wilderness about to die when God appears and tells her to return. God says that Ishmael will be a donkey of a man, and his hand will be against all of his brothers. This is something that will carry out for the rest of the Bible, but also in the modern day. Ishmael is the father of Islam according to Islamic tradition, and the history of hostility between Islam and everyone else, especially the Hebrew people, is easily seen by anyone who knows history at all, thus confirming what God says to Hagar. This little lapse of faith between Sarai and Abram result in the entire religion of Islam. Just let that sink in for a minute. If Abram didn't mess up here, one of the largest religions in the world wouldn't exist. If you want more info on Hagar, Ishmael, and Islam, you can watch the video I did on the topic. I'll put a link in the description. Now we enter chapter 17 and we have a time warp of about 13 years. Abram is now 99 and he still doesn't have his promised son. But God appears to him again and is going to expound the covenant even more with him. God gives the covenant of circumcision with Abram and changes his name from Abram to Abraham. Abram meaning exalted father and Abraham being father of many. Pretty ironic considering this father of many has 0 legitimate children. Just put yourselves in Abraham's shoes right now. God has been telling you for around 2 decades that he'll give you descendants even though your wife isn't getting any younger and you're on the brink of 100. Do you think you would believe God, or would you have a few lapses of faith too? The mistakes Abraham makes, whether it's lying out of fear or trying an alternate solution to producing offspring, they are all very human mistakes that you probably would make too every day. This is something we always need to consider when reading the Bible. It can be easy to be really hard on the people in the stories and to think that they're just so stupid, but in reality, you'd probably make similar mistakes, if not worse ones. We have the luxury of knowing the end of the story. Abraham doesn't. We need to try and put ourselves in their shoes and gain their perspective before throwing any judgment, and this lesson applies to more than just the Bible. By the same measure you judge others, it will be measured against you. Always keep that in mind. So anyways, back to this circumcision covenant. Circumcision is going to be a very big deal in the Bible, and whether someone is or is not circumcised is going to indicate whether or not their parents were following God's covenant. There will be instances of entire generations of children being born without being circumcised, and this is to show that their parents had fallen away from their faith in God and his covenant. For example, the Israelites that die in the wilderness with Moses do not circumcise their children, who end up entering into the promised land, showing their parents were not being faithful to the covenant that God made with them. We also see here that God promises that Sarah will be the one to bear him a son. Abraham laughs and objects and says, "I'm 100 and Sarah is 90. What about Ishmael? Can't he be the chosen son?" But God reiterates that it will be through Sarah. It is very important that it comes through Sarah and not Hagar. For more information on this, see the video I mentioned earlier. The son will be named Isaac, which means he laughs. This is a play on words because Abraham and Sarah will both laugh when they hear the news, and everyone who hears about it also will laugh because it's impossible for a 90-year-old to bear a son. A short time later, 3 men, or at least they look like men, appear before Abraham, and we get a glimpse of what true hospitality looks like. Hospitality is actually very important in the Bible. It's something that we should all strive for. We learn pretty quickly that these aren't just ordinary men. In fact, 2 are angels, and the third is the angel of the Lord himself. Typically, when you see the angel of the Lord show up, it's just Jesus. Just take my word for it for now, because I don't really have time to go into it. So the Lord, Jesus, tells him within earshot of Sarah that Sarah will bear a son. And she laughs, as you'd expect if you were 90 hearing that news. The Lord responds with, "Why did she laugh? Is anything too hard for God?" And Sarah says, "I didn't laugh." And the Lord is like, "No, you did laugh." Elizabeth, who is John the Baptist's mother, will have a similar elderly miraculous birth later in Luke. And need I remind anyone of Mary and Jesus? God can and does do impossible things. We have to trust in him at his word. If he says something, he'll make it happen, even if it's impossible. The 3 men then leave and head for Sodom. Abraham tags along, and the Lord basically says, "Look at what I'm about to do, and teach it to your descendants, and don't let them forget it, or else they'll end up like this too. I'm going to destroy Sodom for their wickedness." God sends the 2 angels into the city while Abraham hangs out and watches with the Lord. Abraham intercedes for Sodom and says, "Far be it from you to sweep away the righteous with the unrighteous." And there's a funny exchange where Abraham talks God down from destroying the city if there are 100 righteous people being found, all the way down to 10. This shows how wicked Sodom actually was, that not even 10 righteous men could be found, and the one who is slightly righteous is Lot, and he's pretty questionable. You'll see why. Upon the angels' arrival into Sodom, who is there to greet them but Lot himself? Oh boy. Lot, what are you doing here? Last time we saw you, you were outside of the city, but now you're in it, in the city gate no less, a place where business is carried out and esteemed members of the city sit. You're partaking in the riches of the city? You moved your whole family in as well? You're marrying your daughters off to the men here? It's really not a good look. It shows that Lot is compromising with sin a lot in his life, no pun intended. He's intermarrying with it and living with it. Let this be a lesson to us. Lot, knowing the evil of the city, strongly persuades the men to come stay with him for the night. They consent, but upon being there for a short time, it says that the men from all over the city, both young and old, surround the house and call for Lot to bring the 2 new guys out so that they can violate them. Lot tries to protect his guests by sending out his own daughters instead, but this doesn't work for reasons you could probably determine for yourselves. And what do they say? "Who is this foreigner to judge us?" Sound familiar? Anytime anyone points out someone's sin, the first thing they usually do is come out and say, "Are you judging me?" Anyways, the men try to break the door down to violate the angels, but fortunately, the angels blind all the men and then say, "Alright, we've seen enough. Time to burn this place to the ground." They urge Lot to leave with his family and tell him not to look back. Lot urges his sons-in-law to go too, but they laugh at him. This is another common theme of those who are deep in the sin of pride. They laugh when told destruction is coming. These sons-in-law are citizens of Sodom, who he allowed for his own daughters to marry. This is not good. Don't do that. Ever. Don't marry your kids off to wicked people and tie your family to wickedness. We're about to see why. Lot gets his family together and they run away into the mountains, but on the way, Lot's wife turns back because she still desires the sin of that place, and she is turned into a pillar of salt. She stands as a reminder for us all to this day. Flee from sin and don't look back, or it will be your destruction. Side note here, but they actually have the real site of Sodom and Gomorrah. You can look into it for yourselves, but the whole place got melted. It's pretty extraordinary and terrifying. So we have to ask, what exactly was the sin of Sodom so we can avoid it for ourselves? Most people would say their primary sin was sodomy, and that is definitely a large part of it, but it isn't the whole picture. Ezekiel gives us some more insight when he says, "Now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and needy. They were haughty and did abominations before me, so I removed them." Arrogance, idleness, being overfed while ignoring the poor, prideful, and did abominations, the same word used for all sexual immoral acts in Leviticus 18. These are the acts that they did that led to their destruction. You know how the Lord said that he is going to show Abraham so that he will teach his descendants not to do the same? Well, Israel is going to do the exact same thing, but even worse, because in Judges 19, the story of Sodom is repeated in Israel. But this time, there aren't any angels to save the day. We'll discuss that when we go through Judges. Just know that Israel's wickedness is going to rival that of Sodom and Gomorrah, and we'll see what happens to them because of it. Now, Lot is going to mess up pretty bad. He's pretty bummed out because everyone he knows died, including his wife. All he's left with now are his 2 daughters. So he starts drinking. A lot, no pun intended. His daughters start thinking, hey, our husbands are dead. There's no men around here. Who will give us children? Perhaps living in Sodom for so long corrupted them a bit, and they devise a plan. Dad's passed out drunk. Let's sleep with him and have children that way. Lot is also culpable for this sin as well, because getting drunk is never an excuse for debauchery in the Bible. 2 sons are born out of the 2 daughters, and they are named Moab and Ben-Ami. They are the fathers of the Moabites and the Ammonites. If you didn't gasp when I said that, let me explain why this is such a big deal. Just like how Abraham's sin resulted in the Ishmaelites and ultimately Islam, Lot's sin results in these 2 nations that will cause a lot, no pun intended, of problems for Israel. This is also kind of a dig against these nations, saying they're the product of an unholy relationship. So now in chapter 20, we see Abraham lying about his wife again to a guy named Abimelech. It's pretty much the same story as before, except this time it's with a Canaanite. This is significant because we know the Canaanites will become very evil in the future, but they aren't completely evil yet. There is a reason this shows up right after the destruction of Sodom. God tells Abraham that he can't have the land right now because the sins of the people in the land have not yet been fulfilled. Another way of saying, they aren't really bad enough for me to destroy them yet. We see that here in this story, where Abraham is actually the bad guy of this chapter, and it's the Canaanite who is the good guy. We will see the story play out again later. Crazy how often this happens, to be honest. But again, lapses in faith. It's not a straight shot up. We go up and down over time. But the main issue of this chapter is actually a little hidden. What did God just promise to Abraham? Sarah will bear him a son within this very year. Who did Abraham almost marry off to another guy? Sarah. So we see that if God didn't intervene here, it could have compromised the entire plan of this promised son coming from Sarah. There would always be a question mark next to Isaac on whether or not Abraham was his father or not. But God, being sovereign over all things, won't let his side of the covenant be broken. Remember, it's an unconditional covenant. He is going to make it happen even if Abraham messes up. With God saving the day, now we see Isaac's birth, and like I said earlier, his name means he laughs. And everyone who hears of this 90-year-old giving birth, they will laugh too. Sarah now is the one with the kid, and she makes Hagar and Ishmael's life hell. She kicks them out, and while they are out in the wilderness again, God shows up to save Hagar and Ishmael. He sends them to Egypt where they will live, and God reiterates his promise to her, saying that he will be the father of great nations as well. The Ishmaelites show up later as slave traders. Nothing has changed there. An interesting note here is that God shows favor even to those who will one day become enemies of his own chosen people. We will see this happen in a much bigger way later when we look at Jonah and Nahum. Alright, so now we are at the huge climax of Abraham's life. He has what God promised to him, a son. The child of promise, who will be the one who carries on his lineage and creates descendants that number greater than all the stars in the sky. Abraham is thrilled and loves his son very dearly. So what does God call Abraham to do next? Kill him. Take your son, your only son, and sacrifice him. A huge shock, I'm sure, to Abraham, but the Bible gives us no details about how Abraham was feeling. All it says is that Abraham arose early the next morning and he went. What could possibly be going on in his head right now? Only God knows. You may be wondering about something. God said, your only son. What about Ishmael? God doesn't even acknowledge it. Ishmael is not the child of promise. Ishmael has essentially been disowned. The sin has been cast out. Isaac is Abraham's only legitimate son as far as God is concerned. Now, I could easily talk for hours about this story and the deep details involved here, but I'm going to keep it as short as possible. If you want more details about this story, watch my summary on Fear and Trembling by Kierkegaard for more. The whole book is about this one chapter. Alright, so on the way to Moriah, Isaac makes an observation. Where is the lamb for the sacrifice? And Abraham replies, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. They arrive, build the altar, and immediately Abraham binds his son Isaac and places him on the altar. He raises his knife to slay his one and only son, but just as he's about to do it, the angel of the Lord calls out and says, Abraham, Abraham, do not lay a hand on the boy. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. Then, immediately, Abraham looks up and sees a ram caught in a bush and takes it to sacrifice it in his son's place. The angel of the Lord blesses Abraham again for his obedience and faith, and then they all return home. Whoa, must have been a tense ride home. Okay, so let's talk about this because there's a lot here. This story is the clearest picture of Christ's crucifixion in the Old Testament. Picture, if you can, the story of Christ going to the cross and overlaying it with this story. Abraham represents God the Father, who places the wood for the offering on his son's back and leads him up the mountain where he will be slain. Abraham carries the fire and the knife, showing that it is ultimately God who is sacrificing his son for the world. Abraham, who is over 100 years old, binds his son. His son willingly allows this and submits to the Father's will. But here is where the story splits. Where Abraham's hand is stayed by the angel of the Lord from slaying his son, God's hand is not. Abraham declares, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. The mountain range of Moriah is the same mountain range that one day Christ will be sacrificed on. That ram that replaced Isaac is Christ. God will provide the sacrifice, and it will be his one and his only son. As we talked about earlier in this video, the angel of the Lord is Christ. So what was Abraham thinking here? Why is this such an act of faith? Let's think about it for a minute. Like I said earlier, there are no insights as to what Abraham is thinking in this story. All we know is he believes God, and his faith works together with his actions until he gets to the point of slaying his son. So how did he come to this conclusion that he could actually slay his own son? Well, if we remember, this command isn't all Abraham is working with. God has promised him in the past a few times that it is through Isaac that his offspring will be reckoned. So if that's true, and God can't lie, then somehow God is going to have to work this out. If Abraham kills his son, God is going to have to find a way to bring offspring out of it somehow. We learn from the book of Hebrews that Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead. So Abraham took both the command and the past promise and used them to justify the slaying of his son. That's some crazy faith. And God, being represented by Abraham in this story, has the same reasoning when it comes to sacrificing his own son. God the Father slays his only son, knowing that he will raise him on the third day from death. Amazing. We are now entering into the last section of the story before we wrap this video up. If you enjoyed or learned something, like, subscribe for more, and share this video with a friend. Comment below if you liked it, because it encourages me to keep making these videos. So, Sarah dies at 127, and Abraham buys her a gravesite from the Hittites. This is significant because it's the only plot of land that Abraham will actually own in the Promised Land prior to the Exodus and the conquest of Canaan. Burial spots are a big deal in the Bible, and people wanted to be buried in their own homeland and with their own ancestors. Being buried with your ancestors will be a theme for blessing in the Bible, and being buried away from them is almost like a curse. Abraham burying Sarah in the Promised Land shows that he is claiming it as his true home, and he will soon be buried there as well. Abraham is now very old, and he's worried about Isaac because he doesn't have a wife yet. There is a great importance to this because all of his future descendants rely on his son having a wife. The notion of modern-day dating is completely foreign to the Bible. It is the parents' responsibility to find spouses for their children. Don't forget this because it'll come back later in the next part. So Abraham sends his servant out to search for a wife in his home country because he doesn't want Isaac marrying a Canaanite. Keep this in mind too, because it's going to come again later. He also sternly warns the servant to never allow Isaac to return to his home country, because God promised this land to them, and if Isaac goes home, that could cause him to want to stay there rather than claim God's promise. This is a temptation for all of us. Sometimes after God promises us something, we could settle for less, even though God wants to bless us abundantly more. The servant gathers a bunch of Abraham's wealth, including 10 camels, and travels to Nahor. The servant has no idea what he's doing, so he does the only logical thing, and he prays to God for help. He says, "If I ask a girl for water, and they get it for me, and water my camels as well, then let that be the girl God has picked for Isaac." The servant wants an extraordinary woman for Isaac. Watering camels is no small feat. They can drink upwards of 30 gallons each. Whoever this girl is, she's going to have a servant's heart if she's going to do this for a complete stranger. Now, before the servant is even finished praying, Rebecca comes out, and just as the servant said, he asked her for some water, and she offered to water the camels as well. After she finished the job, the servant is thrilled, throws some gold on her and says, "Take me to your family." Here we meet Laban. He'll be showing up again later, so don't forget him. He sees the gold and is like, "Whoa, I like that. We should marry you off to whoever gave it to you." The servant explains his mission, and Laban, being wooed by the money, loves every bit of it. From just this chapter, Laban doesn't seem so bad of a guy. But when you learn what he does later, you'll see why this is a big deal. After staying a few nights, the servant is like, "Hey, I want to go home and give this amazing girl to my master's son. Don't restrain me from fulfilling my duty." And after asking Rebecca's consent, they head home. Isaac, while praying in a field, sees his new bride on the way, and he goes to meet her and he marries her. A true love story. Very cool. Abraham fulfills his duty in securing the success of the next generation, and then he dies at 175, where he is then buried with his wife Sarah. He also remarries and has some kids, but he ends up sending them all away so that the promised land can be specifically for Isaac and his offspring. Alright guys, that's all I can do for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, feel free to like, subscribe, and share this video with a friend. I'm enjoying making these, but they are a lot of work, so if you'd like to motivate me to keep making them, a like and a comment of encouragement go a long way. Thanks for watching.